So I'm half Sri Lankan, but I'm also a passing person, which means that I've had a really unique intersection with racism throughout my entire life. When it comes to George Floyd's murder and everything that has happened with the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, these are conversations that people like me have been having for years. When all of these things were happening, I didn't really know exactly how to contribute. I just knew that I was uniquely situated to take the emotional labor off of Black folks and to help answer some basic questions about racism, privilege, and police brutality. I was also very emotional during this time, as of course were so many people. And I was actually inspired to make this really terrible painting back here. But obviously it's not about the quality, it's about the message. And here in this painting, I was just trying to articulate that queer folks need to be protecting Black folks right now. And of course, acknowledging the intersection of those identities and that there do exist Black queer folks who we extra need to protect. So the video I'm about to show was part of a live stream that I did during a fundraiser. I ended up raising over $2,000 for the charity Black Cap TO, which is doing incredible work in Toronto and has been for 30 years. And in the video, I'm just going to talk about a variety of topics related to the Black Lives Matter movement and encourage you to support in whatever way you can. Obviously, there's been so much going on in the world lately, and I'm really happy that there's lots of people out there protesting, and I hope that they will all stay safe. I just don't think that's the right space for me. So what I am doing today is, for those who don't know, as the founder of Queers Canada, over the last 8 years, I did countless workshops related to anti-oppression, and they not only covered systems of homophobia, but they also always covered topics of racism. We've been talking about white privilege for years. We've been having the conversations about microaggressions, racial microaggressions, opening the conversation about police brutality in front of thousands of students and leaders across Canada for 8 years now. But what I thought that I could personally do would be to kind of go over some of these topics and answer questions people have to kind of help take the labor off of Black folks who are, getting a lot of questions right now. And I know for me personally, some of my Black friends have been posting these really tragic and emotional pieces of commentary about how they've been finding themselves crying on a daily basis. They've been finding themselves unable to move. Like, there has been so much racism and Black deaths in the media that have come to fruition for years now. But this George Floyd murder, it has just expanded the conversation in a way that I've never witnessed in this space. It's causing a different reaction to our Black friends and peers and colleagues, and it's definitely important to support them and reach out, but it's also important to know that this is not the time to be asking them for something from them. Like, this is the time to be giving to them and supporting to them, but this is not the time to be asking them for feedback of what you should be doing. There are literally hundreds and thousands of resources that have been sent out there all over Instagram, all over social media. There are so many ways you can help. And, as I was talking about earlier, like, of course there's protesting, but there's so many other things. There's petitions, there's writing letters or calling your political figures in your area. There are things called bailouts, which are helping to release people who have been put to jail for nonviolent crimes and yet have a financial amount they need to spend in order to get bailed out of jail. And there are all these different funds that can help you support. It's sometimes just a few $100s, and that's the reason a Black person is still behind bars. So there's so many different ways that you can support, supporting Black-owned charities, Black-owned businesses. And I think that it's so important that during these times, like, we don't forget that it's not about one person experiencing racism, and it's not about one person who is trying to fix racism. It's about trying to do what we can to change the entire system, which is obviously a very daunting task, and it's so complex, and there's so many different ways to approach that and to try to figure out how to do that. And it's no single thing, it's no single action that is going to fix this, and it's no single weekend that is going to change anything. This is a conversation that has to go on for months and years, and has gone on for months and years, and will continue to go on for months and years. It's so important that whatever energy you feel towards helping you don't let fizzle out when the news cycle stops, because I've already been seeing like new things are happening every day, and the cycle of conversation is changing every day. So while the passion is still there and the posts are still there, they're already different than what they were a few days ago. And that's fine, you know, every single post on social media for the rest of time doesn't need to be about this topic, but it's about internalizing these understandings and internalizing what you need to work on, reflecting in on your own unconscious biases. Every single person has their own biases that they need to overcome. And it's so important to reflect on what you can do, what is within your power, whether it's all those things I mentioned about protesting or donating or signing petitions, whether it's those things, but it's sometimes also just really looking in and reflecting on what have you done wrong? What could you do better? What are ways in which you know that you have these feelings that are complex, that make you uncomfortable, that you think you're not treating people the way you should be treating, or whether you're not expressing those feelings of discomfort, you're thinking those feelings of discomfort. Like, recognize what those things are and reflect on them, because that is what will help move this whole movement forward years down the line. Is if we all can approach these topics in a way where we have changed our fundamental mindset, then we have such a better opportunity in the future to be able to have tangible action items on a daily basis, to catch microaggressions as they're happening, to not ask inappropriate questions, to not encourage your own companies or your own peers to make decisions and put their money where their mouth is, or increase their policies to change. So these are things that are so important. I had a few topics that some people had messaged me about that I wanted to talk about specifically. So firstly, it's about, how is racism even a thing in 2020 is a question I've gotten. So when we talk about racism and when we talk about a system of oppression, we're not talking about one individual person saying a comment. We're not talking about one individual instance. We're talking about generations of trauma, generations of policy. When it comes to Black people specifically, we are literally talking about slavery. I know that people sometimes get all up in arms when it's like, oh, slavery was so long ago and like things have changed and yada yada. But the impacts of slavery could not just disappear overnight and could not just disappear in a few decades, because this is kind of the situation is when policy changes to get rid of overt racism, such as getting rid of slavery, such as allowing Black people to vote, allowing Black people to marry, you know, there have been all these different law changes throughout the years. When these things happen, the policy is step one, but then how people integrate into that policy are the following steps. How society actually reacts to these things and internalizes these things. This is where like a fundamental mindset shift is needed. This is where it gets complicated, because if you point to the policy and you say, hey, look, according to this letter of the law, Black people have XYZ rights, you're correct, and that's fine and dandy. But if the treatment and how they're experiencing their day-to-day lives is not reflective of the spirit of that policy, then it's all a moot point. And this is where we talk about the concept of covert versus overt racism. So overt racism are things like, if you've seen lately this graphic of the iceberg of white supremacy, where like the top is things what we would classify as overt racism, things people don't do anymore, like, you know, saying the N-word directly, like preventing them from voting and all, like these are things that are unacceptable in society. But then there's this whole other bucket of things, this covert racism, these actions that don't seem independently that significant, that in combination result in somebody navigating through life in a horrific way of oppression. So these are things like microaggressions is a huge one that Black people will experience on a day-to-day basis, and queer people experience them, women experience them all sorts of marginalized communities experience them. But when we're talking about racial microaggressions, these are things like, oh, you don't speak, you don't sound like a black person does, or oh, I wouldn't expect that of you, or oh, let me touch your hair, or oh, like these gross comments that are small and little, that people are ignorant of the impact of these statements and sentiments that are just compounding over and over again to help people feel other and different consistently. And then when you extrapolate that out to the extreme, the reason this whole movement has become so big right now is because you would think that a police officer killing a black person would be considered overt racism. You would think that the results of those actions would be people rioting in the streets and demanding justice, which thankfully does happen in the immediate reaction. But then you would also think that would result in these police officers being tried and being prosecuted and being fired and getting different training. And all of these things have been attempted over time. There's been so much content coming out lately about the research behind body cams and extra trainings for officers and all of these things. And unfortunately, a lot of the conclusions to these studies are that they don't help, that it's not enough. And this is where this whole concept of defunding the police comes in, is that we have tried all of these things for so long and they're not working, and black people are still disproportionately dying, disproportionately imprisoned. In Canada, we see Indigenous people also disproportionately imprisoned and jailed and missing and murdered. And these are all results of systemic racism. And the concept of defunding the police is just talking about the idea of, if we reallocate funds, instead of investing more in the police to fund additional programs and additional equipment and all of these things, instead of that, fund communities instead, and to give back to communities, to empower mental health resources, to bring more community program, more sports programs, more food programs, helping the homeless, career advice. Like there are so many different places that this money could be going to that could result in the kind of change that we really need to see over time. So what I think is also important to talk about is privilege. So when we talk about privilege, I wrote something up about white privilege the other day. And as a person of color, I still experience white privilege because I am half Italian. While my Sri Lankan mother raised me more so than the Italian side of my family, and I feel very connected to being a person of color, I recognize that as a white passing person, some people look at me and just think I'm Italian. They don't see the Sri Lankan side. They don't know that. And they therefore treat me accordingly. And because of that, I will never know what it's like to be an Indigenous person, to be a black person. I will never experience those things firsthand. And I will never fear for my life because of the color of my skin walking through the streets in Canada or walking through the streets in America. And that is a privilege that I have. And when it comes to the discomfort of talking about white privilege, I 100% understand that, if you have all these horrible things that have happened to you in life and you've struggled and you feel that why are we taking away, who you are as a person by saying that you have white privilege and then negating everything about you? That's not what white privilege is. White privilege is just recognizing the fact that you have things in your life that you do not experience because of the privileged position you are in. And it's about trying to use that privilege to help other people. It's about recognizing what that privilege does gain you and working towards giving that privilege to other people. It's no easy 1-minute solution. It's about years of dedication towards this work. It's about constantly reevaluating who you are, what you're thinking, what you could be doing. Nothing is going to change immediately. And this is where the protests and the riots and such are helping the cause. Like if you've heard anything about, it's June, it's Pride Month, you've heard anything about how Pride started as a riot, it's because when the Stonewall Inn was raided in New York by police, the beginning of Pride was a protest against police brutality towards queer people. And when we think of the Pride Parade now, we think of it as this fun, corporate sponsored event, but it literally is an annual reminder of those riots that were against the police brutality of queer people and that were led by Black trans women who lost their lives for the cause and initiated what turned into years of slowly a lot of rights and privileges being afforded to queer people. And Black people have gone through waves of this in the past. Like, obviously slavery is illegal, obviously Black people can vote, but keep looking at the realities of the statistics, keep looking at the stories that Black people are sharing of what they're experiencing, and recognizing that if their community is saying that it isn't over, then that means it isn't over. It's not more complicated than that. Like, when it comes to helping marginalized communities, you have to just listen to the marginalized community and hear what they're saying and hear what they need and what they want, and then work towards fixing those things. So when we think about anti-racism and when we think about navigating the next few weeks, my hope is that this time it's different. I can think of protests and riots that happened after many different deaths. Like Trayvon Martin was years ago, and I remember the overwhelming response the public had to that horrible death and situation. And I'm so happy to see people being so passionate right now, but we just need to not lose that fire. Like all the qualms I had about whether or not to go to the protests this weekend during COVID, like this weekend during COVID is important, but what is equally and more important is the length of time that we continue to care about this. It's the fact that we are going to stay engaged in this issue, in these conversations for months and years, and unrelenting on making change and seeing these policies through, seeing these police officers actually prosecuted, seeing actual systemic change. It's not about one thing, is like the biggest thing I would emphasize. It's not about one thing. It has to be consistent long-term effort. And so this is where I would just encourage everyone to not forget. Like, we can't forget about this. We have to keep on this. I have a family member here who is watching, who is married to a Black man and has Black children and is raising Black children. And her and I have had conversations about the complexities of living in New York, witnessing what her children are going through as they navigate, start to learn about these things, witnessing what her husband goes through. As you know, I can name 3 people I personally know who have passed away from COVID, and one of them was an elderly Black woman in New York in a long-term care facility. That is systemic racism in and of itself. The fact that those statistics exist within my own life and are reflected on a larger scale, like COVID is disproportionately impacting BIPOCs, which are Black, Indigenous people of color. And it's because of lack of funding and the areas they're in and the support they're given. These are examples of systemic racism. There's no way to deny this anymore. And for people who think that they can, or who try to, like, you're just at this point opting in to avoiding the situation. Like, if you see those posts that are like, you know, you learn about the Holocaust and you're thinking, what would I have done if I was in the Holocaust? Well, this is that time. Like, this is that now in a different way. Like, people need to just continue to care is the biggest message I would say. People need to continue to care. They need to check in with their Black peers, colleagues, friends, but they can't avoid facing the tough conversations and reflections on the inside. So I think that what I'm gonna do is switch it back to answering some questions in text form, and I'll come back on a live video in a bit. But thank you to the folks who have signed in and watched this so far, and I really hope that you'll continue to fight and won't let this go. So thank you. Black Lives Matter.